Imagine being told calmly by your own mother exactly which of your belongings should go to which sister, in case you didn't come back from the room down the hall. Not a war, not a plague, just labor. In some medieval towns, a woman was more likely to die giving birth than a soldier was to die in a single year of fighting. Before she ever felt the first true pain of labor, many women had already written what we might now call a will, quietly, without panic, because everyone around her understood. This was simply what childbirth was. Hi friends, tonight we're going somewhere very old and very human. A place of candlelight and closed shutters, of women helping women, in a world with no doctors waiting outside the door, no machines humming softly nearby, no certainty of tomorrow. If you're the type who likes to get truly cozy before a story like this, now's the moment. Dim the lights if you can. Pull a blanket up over your shoulders. Let your eyes soften. Tonight isn't about fear. It's about understanding, gently, how women once carried the whole weight of bringing new life into the world, almost entirely alone. Picture a small village somewhere in medieval Europe. Perhaps England, perhaps a corner of France or the German lands. The year could be 1200 or 1400. The details shift slightly by region and century, but the bones of the story stay remarkably the same. You are a young woman, perhaps 19, perhaps 22. You are married. You likely have been for 2 or 3 years already, because that is simply when marriage happened. And now, for the third time, you feel that low, dragging ache low in your belly that tells you the waiting is over. There is no calendar app counting down your weeks. No gentle chime reminding you of an appointment. You have counted the moons yourself, quietly on your fingers, the way your mother taught you, and the way her mother taught her. You already know, somewhere calm and resigned inside you, that this day carries real risk. Not abstract risk, real risk. In many parts of medieval Europe, historians estimate that somewhere between 1 and 2 out of every 100 births ended in the mother's death. And when you consider that a woman might give birth 6, 8, even 12 times across her life, the odds accumulate into something staggering. For many women, the chance of eventually dying in childbed crept close to 1 in 10, sometimes higher depending on where and when they lived. 1 in 10. Imagine sitting with 10 friends, and one of you would not survive childbirth. That was simply life. A soft gust of wind rattles the wooden shutters. Somewhere outside, a rooster calls too early, confused by the gray morning light. You don't scream when the first true contraction hits. You breathe the way you were taught. You've helped at 2 other births already, a cousin's, a neighbor's, so you know, in your body if not in words, roughly what is coming. Your husband is sent away. This is not his room. This has never been his room. Childbirth, in the medieval world, belonged entirely to women, a closed, private, almost sacred female space called, in many regions, the lying-in chamber. Men were not simply discouraged from entering. In many towns it was considered deeply improper, even a little frightening, for a man to witness what happened there. The room itself is prepared with a strange, careful ritual. The windows are shuttered, sometimes even covered with heavy cloth, and any small gaps or keyholes are stuffed with rags. This wasn't only for warmth. Many believed that evil spirits, restless souls, or simply bad luck could slip in through any opening, drawn toward the vulnerability of a laboring woman and her unborn child. Mirrors, if the household owned one, might be covered too, or turned to the wall, a lingering echo of older superstitions about reflections trapping souls. At the moment new life entered the world, a fire is kept burning low and steady, filling the room with warmth and a soft, smoky scent that mixes with dried herbs hung along the beams. Rosemary, perhaps, or lavender, believed to ease pain and ward off illness. You can hear it crackling gently as you settle onto a low stool, not a bed. Birthing stools, simple wooden chairs with a crescent-shaped opening cut into the seat, were common across much of medieval Europe, allowing gravity to help, and allowing the women attending you to kneel close, hands ready. Around you gather the women who will see you through this. Not doctors, not surgeons. A midwife, usually, an older woman of the village, respected, sometimes even a little feared, who has attended dozens, perhaps hundreds, of births in her lifetime. She carries no formal medical training in the way we'd recognize today. Her knowledge comes from experience, from her own mother or aunt who trained her, from decades of watching bodies labor and sometimes fail. Beside her, your own mother, if she's living, your sisters, if you have them nearby, neighbor women who have birthed children themselves and understand wordlessly what you are about to go through. This gathering had a name in many places. Gossips, an old word that simply meant close female companions. Women who shared God talk and were bound to one another through exactly these moments. Someone murmurs a prayer under her breath, low and steady, like a second heartbeat in the room. There is comfort in this crowded, warm room, even amid the fear. You are not alone. You will not be alone for a single moment of what's coming. And yet, everyone in that room, including you, understands with quiet clarity that not everyone leaves this room the same as they entered it. Here is something that might surprise you. In many medieval parishes, a priest, or occasionally the midwife herself, given special permission by the church, would come to a woman before labor began, especially if it was expected to be a difficult birth, and perform something close to a blessing, sometimes even administering last rites in advance, not because death was certain, but because it was common enough that the church built entire rituals around preparing for it. Think about that gently for a moment. A woman receiving something like a final blessing, not on her deathbed, but before bringing life into the world. Both possibilities held in the very same breath. It tells you everything about how medieval society understood birth, not as a medical event, but as a passage, a doorway that could open onto new life or onto death, and no one could say for certain which side you'd walk through until it was already done. Your labor stretches on. There is no clock to watch, only the slow burning of a candle marked with lines, or the position of light through a crack in the shutters, or simply the rhythm of your own breathing, hour folding quietly into hour. The midwife rubs warmed oils along your belly and lower back, sometimes goose fat, sometimes olive oil if the household could afford it, occasionally infused with herbs believed to loosen and soften the body for labor. She speaks to you in a low, practiced voice, the same tone she has likely used at every birth she's attended. Steady, unhurried, familiar. Someone in the room might be asked to open every knot in the house, untie any laces on your clothing, unlock chests, even unbraid your hair. This wasn't idle superstition to them. It was believed quite seriously that binding of any kind, cords, knots, locks, could magically bind up the birth itself, trapping the child. So hands move quietly through the house, undoing, loosening, releasing. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolls the hour, its sound muffled and soft through the shuttered window, like it's speaking through water. Hours pass this way. You are given small sips of warmed ale, or a broth if you can manage it. Nothing solid, nothing heavy. Someone hums, low and wordless, the kind of sound meant more to soothe than to entertain. The women around you take turns holding your hands, wiping your forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement in the same handful of phrases their own mothers once murmured to them. There is a strange, tender rhythm to it all. Pain and comfort, fear and companionship, all woven into the very same hours. And when, finally, your child is born, when that first thin cry fills the smoky, herb-scented air, the relief in the room is immediate and enormous. Someone laughs, a small surprised sound, half sob. Someone else is already moving, to help you, to check the baby, to begin the next long list of careful rituals that follow a birth safely completed. But even this moment, this precious, longed-for moment, carries its own quiet danger tucked just behind it, because surviving the birth itself was only the first hurdle. What came in the hours and days directly afterward claimed just as many mothers as the labor ever did. There was a fever that could rise, slow and silent, in the days following birth. One that midwives watched for with a kind of tired, practiced dread, because by the time it truly showed itself, there was very little anyone could do. There was a fever that could rise, slow and silent, in the days following birth. One that midwives watched for with a kind of tired, practiced dread, because by the time it truly showed itself, There was very little anyone could do. It had no single name across medieval Europe. In some regions, they simply called it childbed fever. In others, it was spoken of more vaguely, a heat, a sickness of the womb, something that crept in uninvited during the days a new mother should have been resting, healing, growing stronger. You, resting now in the same low-lit chamber where your child was born only hours before, don't yet know to fear it. Right now, there is only relief. Your baby is wrapped snugly, already handed briefly around the room from one set of careful hands to another, each woman murmuring some small blessing over the tiny face. You are exhausted in the particular, hollowed-out way that only follows something your whole body has just survived. Somewhere in the room, a woman quietly gathers the linens, folding them with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this many, many times before. For now you are simply told to rest. And in the medieval world, rest after childbirth wasn't a suggestion. It was practically a sacred obligation, wrapped in its own careful set of customs. This period had a name too, the lying in. Depending on the region and your family's means, it could last anywhere from a few days to a full month. Wealthier women, noble women, merchants' wives, might be permitted, even expected, to lie in bed for 3 or 4 weeks, attended constantly, doing nothing but healing. Poorer women, especially those working small farms, or helping run household with no servants, sometimes had no such luxury. A peasant woman might be back on her feet within days. However, her body actually felt about it, because the animals still needed feeding and the bread still needed baking, fever or no fever. This is worth sitting with gently for a moment. The sheer unfairness folded quietly into something as universal as childbirth. Rest, and the chance it gave the body to heal and fight infection, was never distributed evenly. It was something wealth could buy, even in the Middle Ages. A log shifts and settles in the hearth, sending up a small shower of orange sparks that catch the low light. During this lying-in, the room stayed exactly as shuttered and enclosed as it had been for the birth itself. Fresh air was often considered dangerous, drafts believed to invite illness straight into a body already weakened and open. So the smoke lingers, the warmth stays thick and close, and you drift in and out of a heavy, dreamless kind of sleep. Your baby beside you, the women of the household moving quietly around you, like tide moving around stone. For 2 days, perhaps 3, this goes well. Your body aches in the ordinary way of recovery. You are sore, tender, tired in your very bones, but nothing more. And then, on the 3rd or 4th day, sometimes a little later, the fever begins. It's easy, in hindsight, with the eyes of the present looking backward, to know exactly what was happening in rooms like this one, over and over, across centuries. Childbirth in the medieval period involved almost no understanding of bacteria, no concept of germs at all. Hands that had just tended animals, prepared meals, touched soiled linens, or attended a previous birth would move directly to helping deliver the next child, with nothing more than perhaps a rinse in a basin of water. Water that was, itself, often reused from earlier in the day. The midwife meant only kindness. Every woman in that room meant only kindness, and yet, without knowing it, their careful loving hands were sometimes the very thing that carried infection from one body into another. You don't know any of this, of course, lying in your bed on the 4th day, feeling a strange creeping heat begin low in your belly and spread slowly outward. At first it feels almost like nothing, a warmth, a heaviness, a vague unease that's easy to blame on simple exhaustion. By evening it is unmistakable. A woman presses the back of her hand gently against your forehead, and you feel her stillness before you hear her voice change. The women around you know this pattern well, even without understanding its cause. They have seen it before, in a sister, a neighbor, a mother of their own. The fever rising, the chills that follow, deep and rattling, even as the skin burns hot to the touch. A tenderness in the belly that makes even the lightest touch unbearable. Sometimes a foul-smelling discharge, which the midwife would note with a grim, practiced glance, saying little, because there was little left to say. There was no medicine that could touch what was happening inside you. No antibiotics, not for another 600 years. What treatments existed were, by modern understanding, almost entirely powerless against this particular illness. Herbal poultices pressed against the belly, warmed wine mixed with spices believed to draw out heat and poison, prayers said over you in a low, steady murmur that never quite stopped. Some women survived this fever. Their bodies, stronger or simply luckier, fought the infection off on their own, and within a week or two they were pale but recovering, sitting up, nursing their child, the danger slowly loosening its grip. Historians estimate that childbed fever, across various periods and regions of medieval and early modern Europe, was responsible for a significant portion of all maternal deaths. In some accounts and time periods, rivaling or even exceeding deaths from the birth itself. Think of that gently. A woman could survive the labor, survive the birthing stool, the long hours, the fear, the blood, the sheer physical ordeal of bringing a child into the world, only to lose her life quietly, days later in the very bed where she was meant to be recovering. Outside, faintly, you can hear the sound of someone drawing water from the village well. The rope creaking against the wooden pulley, ordinary life continuing, indifferent and unaware. If the fever worsened rather than broke, the room's mood would shift in a way that was never spoken aloud but was felt by everyone present. The women's voices grew softer still. Someone would quietly be sent to fetch the priest. Not always for last rites this time, since those might already have been given before the birth, but sometimes for a final blessing, a final visit, a chance to say what needed saying. And here is something tender, something worth holding on to in the middle of all this heaviness. Even in these hardest moments, medieval women were rarely, if ever, left to face this alone. The same circle of gossips who had gathered for the birth stayed through the fever too, taking turns at your bedside, keeping the fire fed, keeping your lips moistened with water or watered wine, singing low songs meant for exactly this, for easing a hard passage, whichever direction it led. There is a particular kind of grief that lived in medieval households because of this fever, a grief so common it had its own quiet rituals built around it. If a mother did not survive, but her infant did, there were established customs for what came next. A wet nurse found quickly, sometimes already living in the household, in preparation for exactly this possibility. The mother's belongings distributed according to wishes she may have spoken aloud in the earliest days after birth, almost like the private will many women made before labor even began. And if both mother and child were lost, which did happen more often than any of us would wish, the community's response was swift, practiced, and deeply compassionate in its own quiet way. Neighbors brought food. Women who had lost children or sisters of their own to the very same fever came to sit, wordless, simply present, because they understood in a way words couldn't reach. A single bell tolls somewhere in the distance, slow, spaced, deliberate, the particular rhythm used across many medieval parishes to mark a death in the village. But your story tonight does not end here in this fevered room. Let's say, gently, kindly, that your body was one of the fortunate ones. The fever breaks on the 6th night, the heat slowly loosening its grip, your breathing evening out, your eyes finally closing into something like real, restful sleep for the first time in days. You will survive this one, this time, and yet, even as you recover, even as the women around you begin to relax, begin to smile again, begin bringing you thicker broths and softer bread to help rebuild your strength. There is one part of this whole ordeal that hasn't been spoken of yet. One thing that shaped every single decision made in that shuttered room long before your labor ever began. A quiet, careful world of charms, saints, and small protective rituals that no one in that chamber would have dreamed of skipping. Because in a world with no real medicine, belief itself became a kind of medicine of its own. Even as you recover, even as the women around you begin to relax, begin to smile again, begin bringing you thicker broths and softer bread to help rebuild your strength, there is one part of this whole ordeal that hasn't been spoken of yet. One thing that shaped every single decision made in that shuttered room long before your labor ever began. A quiet, careful world of charms, saints, and small protective rituals that no one in that chamber would have dreamed of skipping, because in a world with no real medicine, belief itself became a kind of medicine of its own. Let's go back, gently, to the weeks before your labor began, because the preparation for a medieval birth started long before the first contraction ever arrived. In many households across medieval Europe, one saint in particular was called upon above all others when it came to childbirth, Saint Margaret of Antioch. Her story, as it was told and retold through the centuries, involved being swallowed whole by a dragon and emerging unharmed. A legend that made her, in the medieval imagination, a natural protector for women facing the terrifying, body-consuming ordeal of labor. If anyone understood surviving something that threatened to swallow you whole, it was her. A single candle flame flickers, bending sideways for a moment as a draught slips beneath the door, then steadies again. Small written prayers to Saint Margaret, sometimes copied onto tiny strips of parchment by a local priest or a literate family member, were folded and tied with thread, then worn against the belly, hidden beneath clothing, throughout the final weeks of pregnancy. Some women kept these little parchment charms, sometimes called birth girdles, when they took the form of a long strip of prayers and blessings, wrapped around their bodies during labor itself, believed to physically ease the passage of the child into the world. A handful of these birth girdles have actually survived to the present day, tucked away in museum archives. Long strips of parchment, sometimes several feet in length, covered edge to edge in tiny, careful handwriting, prayers, blessings, protective verses meant to be worn, wrapped snugly around a laboring woman's body like a sash. Imagine that for a moment, an entire scroll of hopeful, hand-copied words, close enough to your skin to feel their weight, meant to hold you together through the hardest hours of your life. You, in your own labor, likely wore something similar. Perhaps not a full girdle, if your family couldn't afford to commission one, but, at the very least, a small folded charm or blessed medallion, tucked close against your body, given to you by your mother or the local priest, with quiet, careful instructions on exactly how it should be worn. Somewhere in the walls, a mouse scurries briefly, then falls still again. Relics, too, played their part in medieval childbirth, physical objects believed to carry the protective power of a saint. In wealthier households, or in towns with access to a monastery or great church, a woman in difficult labor might be brought a relic to touch or hold. Perhaps a small fragment of bone kept in an ornate case, or a strip of cloth said to have touched the body of a saint. In some recorded cases, entire relics, the girdle of the Virgin Mary, kept and venerated at certain great churches, was one particularly famous example, were loaned out temporarily to noblewomen in labor, carried carefully from the church to the birthing chamber, and back again once the birth was complete. This tells you something quietly remarkable about how seriously medieval society regarded the danger of childbirth. These relics were treasures, precious, carefully guarded, rarely allowed to leave their churches for any reason. And yet, for a woman in labor, exceptions were made. The danger was considered real enough, and the need for protection sacred enough, to bend even the strictest rules. Beyond saints and relics, an entire quiet layer of smaller, more folk-rooted superstitions moved through the birthing chamber too. Customs passed mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, with little written explanation, simply understood as the way it's done. We already spoke of the undone knots, the unlocked chests, the loosened hair, all meant to prevent anything binding or trapping the birth. But there were more. In some regions, a woman's husband was asked to hand over his belt during labor, which would then be tied loosely around her waist, believed to transfer some measure of his strength into her body during the hardest hours. In others, a specific stone, sometimes called an eagle stone, a hollow rattling rock believed to ease childbirth when tied to the thigh, was kept in the household, passed carefully from one laboring woman to the next, treated with the same seriousness we might give a piece of medical equipment today. A soft rustle of fabric, someone shifting a blanket, tucking it more snugly around your shoulders. Certain foods were avoided in the final weeks of pregnancy, believed to affect the child's temperament or appearance. Strawberries, in some regions, thought to cause birthmarks if eaten too eagerly. Certain foods were encouraged, too: warm possets of milk, honey, and spice, believed to strengthen the womb and prepare the body for what was coming, and prayer, near constant, quiet, ongoing prayer, threaded through every part of this preparation. Litanies said aloud by the gathered women during labor itself, invoking not only Saint Margaret, but often a whole chain of saints, one after another, each believed to offer their own particular kind of protection. The Virgin Mary herself, understood in medieval devotion as someone who had, after all, once given birth herself, held a particularly tender place in these prayers. Women in labor were often encouraged to picture her gentle presence beside them, unseen but real, holding their hand through hours. No husband, brother, or father was ever permitted to witness. It's worth pausing here, gently, to notice something quietly beautiful, tucked inside all of this. In a world utterly without the medicine we take for granted today, no pain relief beyond herbs and warmed wine, no understanding of infection, no way to intervene if something went wrong inside the body, women built, instead, an entire architecture of comfort, saints to call upon, relics to hold, charms to wear against the skin. A whole community of other women gathered close, murmuring the same prayers their own mothers once murmured over them. None of it, we now understand, could stop an infection or correct a difficult birth position. But all of it together did something real nonetheless. It meant that no woman labored in true isolation. Even in a chamber with shuttered windows and no possibility of outside help arriving in time, she labored surrounded by centuries of accumulated care. However imperfect its tools, the fire settles into low, steady embers, casting a soft orange glow across the room, the last of the evening's wood nearly spent. There is one more layer to this world of preparation, though, one that circles us back, quietly, to something mentioned at the very start of tonight's story. The last rites given before labor even began. Because for some women, those whose earlier births had gone badly, those carrying a child that midwives, through careful hands-on examination, suspected might be positioned wrong, or those simply considered, for whatever reason, to be at higher risk. This spiritual preparation went further still, and understanding exactly what that final preparation looked like in its full and tender detail brings us gently back to where we began. There is one more layer to this world of preparation, though, one that circles us back, quietly, to something mentioned at the very start of tonight's story. The last rites given before labor even began, because for some women, those whose earlier births had gone badly, those carrying a child that midwives, through careful hands-on examination, suspected might be positioned wrong, or those simply considered, for whatever reason, to be at higher risk. This spiritual preparation went further still. Let's sit gently with this now, the way it truly happened. In the final days before labor, if a woman or her family had reason to fear the birth ahead, a priest would be sent for. Not urgently, not in a panic, but with the same quiet, how practical steadiness the medieval world brought to most matters of life and death. He would come to the home, sit with the woman a while, hear her confession, and offer her the same rites that would otherwise be reserved for the very end of life. Extreme unction, it was often called, a final anointing meant to prepare the soul. A low murmur of Latin prayer fills the room, soft and unhurried, the words themselves less important than the steady, grounding rhythm of them. Imagine sitting across from a priest, quite calm, quite lucid, quite alive, and receiving, all the same, the words meant to ease a soul's passing. Not because death was promised, simply because it was possible, and possible enough that preparing for it felt like wisdom rather than pessimism. And here is the truly tender part of this ritual. The part that reveals something gentle about how medieval communities actually understood this risk. This blessing was never treated as a grim omen hanging over the household. Families didn't whisper about it afterward, didn't treat the woman differently, didn't let it darken the days that followed. It was simply one more careful preparation, tucked alongside the birth girdle, the loosened knots, the gathered herbs. One more way of meeting an uncertain outcome with as much readiness and care as anyone could offer. You, in your own story tonight, received something like this before your third labor. A quiet visit, a soft prayer, your mother's hand resting on your shoulder throughout. And then, when it was done, life simply continued. The visit was folded quietly into the ordinary rhythm of preparing for birth. No different, really, from packing clean linens or setting aside warm ale for the hours ahead. Outside, the wind has settled. The kind of stillness that comes just before dawn, when even the birds haven't yet decided to wake. This is, perhaps, the truest thing to understand about how medieval women faced childbirth. Not with the constant dread we might imagine from our vantage point centuries later, but with a kind of steady, practiced acceptance. Danger was real, yes. Death was possible, yes. More possible than we can easily imagine today. But fear, on its own, changed nothing about the outcome. So instead, women built an entire world of careful preparation around that fear, practical, spiritual, communal, and then simply continued living inside it, marrying, conceiving, laboring, recovering, grieving when grief was needed, and celebrating just as fully when celebration was earned instead. And celebration, when it came, was real and warm and full. If you're following your own story tonight, the one we began at the very start of this long, gentle evening, you already know how it ends for you. The fever broke. Your body healed, slowly, over the careful weeks of your lying in. Your child grew stronger in your arms, day by quiet day. There was a custom in many parishes called churching, a formal blessing given to a mother, once her lying-in period was complete, usually about a month after birth, that marked her return to ordinary life, to church, to the outside world beyond the shuttered chamber. It was, in its own quiet way, a small celebration of survival, not spoken of in such blunt terms, but understood, all the same, by every woman present. You had done something the world quietly acknowledged was dangerous, and you had come through it. A soft bell, different from the earlier, mournful toll, rings out clear and bright somewhere across the village, marking morning rather than morning. Think back, now, gently, to the very beginning of tonight's story, that startling thought we opened with, a young woman, quietly deciding which of her belongings should go to which sister, just in case. It's easy, hearing that at the start, to feel only the weight of it, the fear folded into something as ordinary and universal as bringing a child into the world. But now, having walked through the whole of it together, the shuttered chamber, the gathered women, the fever that waited, the saints called upon, the blessing given before the beginning, perhaps that same image feels a little different. Not less serious, not less real, but held, now, inside a fuller picture. A picture of women who faced real, enormous risk, and met it not with helplessness, but with community, with ritual, with centuries of accumulated care passed carefully from one set of hands to the next. Most women, across the long stretch of the medieval world, did survive their births, even against odds that would startle us today. And the ones who didn't were never ever alone in the moment it mattered most. Surrounded, always, by other women who understood exactly what was being asked of them, and who gave everything they had, their hands. Hands, their prayers, their steady, quiet presence, to help see it through. The candle in the room has burned low now, its flame small and soft, casting long, gentle shadows across the walls. So if, tonight, you found yourself drawn into that quiet chamber, with its shuttered windows and its low fire, and its circle of watchful, caring women, let it settle over you now, softly, as you drift towards sleep of your own. No danger waiting in your own room tonight. No fever to fear. Just the quiet and the dark and the same gentle human instinct that has always existed, in every century, to care for one another, especially in the hardest, most uncertain hours. If this story kept you company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, but only if it felt worth it. Either way, I'm glad you were here. Ret now. You've earned it. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing slow. Let the candle in that old quiet room burn all the way down, gently, into soft and peaceful dark. Good night.